planning. And do this one as sort of a second in that series about language access planning. And today we're going to cover resources, rules and responsibilities, and some evaluation strategies that can be applied sort of across government, nonprofit, private sector organizations. A lot of this stuff is really transferable. There's kind of a Venn diagram where different kinds of service providers meet in the middle, and a lot of the same stuff will apply. So hopefully it can be helpful to all of you. And today we're going to think about, which language accessibility resources fit your needs, kind of identify the key roles and responsibilities within your organizations to make sure that there is implementation and accountability. And then we're going to talk about some evaluation techniques to make sure that, all of the language access policies, procedure, and data that you're collecting and performing are updated regularly. So before I jump in, I wanted to remind everyone again about the Thursday office hours. And if you have not taken the survey that Melissa sent out, I think that is still open. And those links we can get to you if you need them again. So jumping right into the purpose and objectives for today's session, it kind of, like I said, goes hand in hand with our previous session. And I wanted to just take a few minutes to review the 3 language access planning components that we discussed last week, just because these all kind of do fit together, sort of like pieces of a puzzle. So last week we talked about assessing your needs and the needs of your communities. And this is sort of like the who, what, the when, where, and why of your region's English learners, as well as the needs of your organization or any current or prospective consumers whose preferred language and written language is a language other than English. So who are the English learners in your service area? What is or are there levels of interaction with your organization? What are your points of contact? And what are the needs, shortcomings, or successes of your own organizations with regard to what you're doing currently around language access, your current policies and procedures? We also talked about defining the scope of the services that you're going to provide. So that section sort of introduced the idea of having a plan within your plan.
Implemented yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought somebody had a question. So, that talked about sort of which services you're going to commit to providing for your consumers, who your service providers are, what your quality control sort of measures are going to be. And we also talked about how you're going to ensure that written translations are accurate and effective, choosing which documents are your vital documents, what your modalities or services you prefer to offer, which non-written mediums you'll use to reach low literacy communities or language groups that are not written, for example, languages of limited diffusion. And remember that it is so crucial to work directly with the English learning communities that you're serving to make sure that your services are culturally relevant and appropriate and that their voice is heard in this process. We also talked about how to let your constituents, consumers, subjects know that you're going to be providing these services through, providing notice. And this just, means making sure you have the resources, the tools, and some sort of a plan in place to communicate the scope of services that you're going to provide to your target audience. We talked about I Speak cards, individual notices, taglines, language ID charts, social media, SMS, robocalls, things like that to be able to reach people. And with that being said, I think most people on this call are aware of the main types of language access. Oops, I'm sorry, I missed a slide there. The main types of language access resources used to communicate with English learners, but it does bear repeating. Most commonly, I think you'll find that in-person oral interpretation, notwithstanding video interpretation for the deaf community. Today we're focusing on English learners who do communicate verbally and orally. Written translation, video remote interpretation or VRI, and over-the-phone interpretation or OPI. So these are the primary tools. There are many other language access resources, but these are the main tools used by organizations like hospitals and schools and government organizations, and as well as the nonprofit and the private sector. Note that OPI and VRI are standard industry terms, and they stand for over the phone interpretation and video remote interpretation, respectively. Those are sort of like the common terms you'll hear when you're talking to your language service providers or whenever you're sifting through language access resources on the internet. I also want to explain that within the sort of sphere of in-person oral interpretation, the two most common modalities of oral in-person are consecutive and simultaneous interpretation. Consecutive interpretation is the start and stop interpretation, in which a subject will speak 2 or 3 sentences and then pause to allow the interpreter time to interpret. This is by far the most common modality of interpretation used to communicate with English learners, mostly in legal consults, school meetings, doctor's appointments, social work visits, therapeutic sessions, meetings, etc. Simultaneous interpretation is used when an interpreter must interpret in real time, sort of as somebody is speaking. And this modality is common during conferences, diplomatic interactions, business negotiation, tours, things of that nature, where there's really not time or ability to stop to allow that interpreter time to interpret. So there are two sort of different skill sets. Most of you most often will be dealing with consecutive interpretation, I imagine, although certainly simultaneous interpretation is common. And we did talk last week about defining your scope of services, and part of that is sort of having a plan in place to offer some or all of these different language access resources, from putting out RFPs to building positive relationships with your providers. You'll sort of have to decide on which of these services you can commit to providing realistically, which of these services to provide in different situations, and you'll want to have a way to evaluate the quality and the success of each. We'll talk about evaluation toward the end of today's workshop. So the big thing that I want to talk about, the next section, is who's going to bring your plan to life, right? Who are the people that are going to be responsible? You really want to pin down, before you start putting the other pieces of your language access plan together, who is going to drive the bus once the passengers are boarded, right? Forgive the corny analogy, but that really is appropriate. And, in my experience, a lot of the language access plans and the templates that are out there on the internet don't really do a deep enough dive into this area. And then you end up with this great plan that just sits on a cloud drive somewhere, and maybe a patchwork or a piecemeal implementation across an organization instead of a well-planned execution, right? So I personally recommend that you identify the following roles and define them, as a primary section of your plan. The first one would be a language access coordinator. And this is a person who has the authority to make decisions and to influence colleagues, who has time and flexibility to dedicate efforts to language access policy implementation, somebody who has an understanding of the needs of the community being served, as well as an intimate knowledge of the internal departmental processes within your organization that have to take place in order to meet those needs. So, some common responsibilities of a language coordinator, language access coordinator, can include like conceptualizing, writing, revising your language access plan, right? Remember that it's a living document, so you don't just write it and then that's it. It's going to evolve and change as your community's needs change and as your organization grows and changes. Language access coordinators identify and get buy-in from departmental colleagues on like which documents should be translated. They're constantly identifying into which languages you want to translate and keeping their finger on the pulse of changing demographics. making sure that there is like a timely and systematic translation and quality assurance process, working with appropriate departmental officials and those critical communicators that we talked about back in the second session, in terms of the dissemination of your translated documents, establishing mechanisms to monitor and evaluate the implementation of your plan, and to serve as an external liaison with other departments, right? Or other segments of your business or organization. So language access coordinator, for sure. Hopefully you can all convince the powers that be to write that into a budget, because it's a big one. The next big important thing would be point people within.
I have 15 minutes till you go.
What's that, Melissa? Was that you?
Oh, I'm sorry. I did not know I was not on mute. Sorry.
Oh, no, fine. Sorry to interrupt. So point people within each department or segment of your organization are going to be crucial also. And these are, individuals within different departments or other areas of governance who are given specific responsibilities with regard to like implementing that plan, or like if it's not possible for you to directly assign or require those responsibilities, there are people who can be given training in the best practices of language access, and they can be asked to act as leaders within their respective departments. So these could be your liaison staff who are on the ground, your frontline staff. Examples would be like a director or a head nurse or a policy coordinator who can make sure that their staff understand how and when to use the different language resources that are available to them. And these are people who can regularly ensure that this is happening in a meaningful way, right? I think it's really important to have those champions within each department and to keep the relationships warm, right? To check in, monthly, even quarterly, but just make sure that you're checking in with each other and not letting these things fall by the wayside. Another thing that I have heard many organizations have great success with is the concept of having a volunteer bank of trained bilingual volunteers. One of the biggest obstacles to overcome when it comes to providing language assisted services is cost, right? As I'm sure we all know, especially now. The funding is tight, and a lot of organizations, including the Immigrants and Internationals Advisory Council in my county, have had some success with this concept of like building and maintaining a volunteer bank of trained, and I really stress trained, committed community volunteers who are willing to donate their time as interpreters. I think especially in the current political climate, you'll find that there are a lot of people who are motivated to do this, and given the right tools and training, I think they can be really effective. So if you are going to go down this road, and as part of your language access plan, it's really important to remember two things. One, I'm sorry, I misread my notes. I want to stress the training again. That's where I kind of left off and lost my way. Keeping this list current and active is a decent amount of work, right? So it's not just like a list that you compile and then leave there because people move, people become unavailable, people get into doing different things. So, this can be another compelling way to advocate for a language access coordinator, and this can be a good job for a language access coordinator. And when I say this could be a compelling way to advocate for a language access coordinator, think about the money that you can save on language services if your organization, spends roughly that equivalent on a language access coordinator salary, right? So I know that unfortunately money is a mover of decision makers sometimes. So if you can make that case and show some data about how community volunteers that are coordinated and maintained by this language access coordinator can save your organization money, I think that that's really a helpful tool. So the final sort of group with the who's going to bring your plan to life are your trained bilingual staff. and ultimately providing, what we call in-language. This is another industry term, by the way. In-language communication is simply providing direct services to consumers in their language, as opposed to providing those services in a language other than their language through an interpreter, right? So direct in-language communication, is ultimately like, the most cost-effective way to provide language access, right? This could be call center staff, administration staff, executive staff, really anyone who is willing and able to use their language skills for this purpose. And you want to make sure these are native or near native speakers. Like, you don't want to just throw the person who majored in Spanish but hasn't used it for 10 years out there in the field. You want to make sure that you can vet language skills somehow. And this is where those two things come in. There are sort of two things that it's important to remember about using bilingual staff. Number one is that you really have to provide interpreter and translation best practices training to these individuals. And number two is that you can't force employees to do this work or expect them to do it for free. So their job descriptions need to be altered to include this task, and the pay they receive should reflect this additional responsibility. And moving forward, if you are hiring, I think it's always great to consider candidates who have language skills and to write that into the job description from the beginning, so that people understand that this is part of their role going in. And a side note, I think a great idea for keeping all of these people connected and for keeping relationships warm is to hold quarterly trainings on a rolling basis that both bilingual staff, community volunteers, and your contracted interpreter translators can attend. There are, a couple other groups that sort of fit under this category of who's going to bring your plan to life. Those are your language service providers, or LSPs, which is also an industry term, LSP, language service provider, and those critical communicators that we talked about. So the LSPs are the vendors that you're going to use to provide the OPI, the VRI, the in-person interpretation, and the translation services that you're going to be offering to your consumers. Set the terms and negotiate contracts with your language service providers in advance, and keep them current. Advocate for a budget line to spend on these services so that it's not an afterthought and you can do a proper RFP, or you can really put something formal in place. And you want to build positive relationships with these providers, because oftentimes, they'll help you by doing little things for free or volunteering services in exchange for publicity and things like that. There's a lot more flexibility and room to negotiate than you would think with language service providers, especially if you're using small local providers, which I would recommend just to keep money in your local economy, of course. So, things to keep in mind when you're choosing a language service provider: operational security and reliability, right? A lot of language service providers are small teams that come and go, and almost every company will say that they're stable and reliable, but don't just take them at their word. Ask them to provide some kind of evidence, like how long have they been in business? What types of services do they offer? Over the phone, interpretation, video, remote, on-site, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do they utilize call centers, or do they just work with work-from-home contractors? How do they handle customer or sensitive information, protected health information, things like that? How do they audit their processes? Can you audit their processes on site? Do they take calls from offshore call centers, or are there interpreters here in the United States? Another thing you want to keep in mind when choosing an LSP is the quality of their interpreters, right? So what kind of training do they offer their interpreters? Do their interpreters have specific areas of expertise? How do you monitor quality assurance, and how often, or how do they monitor quality assurance and how often? And is there a formal quality assurance program, right? Like, how are they testing people? How are they making sure that their interpreters are qualified? The third thing to keep in mind is visibility. Do they provide some kind of online portal so that you can access all of your information, like if it's an over the phone thing, you want to be able to see a call log. If you have a contract cap, you want to be able to see how much you've spent it down and things like that if you don't have those numbers readily available. You know, is their data real time or is it only archived? Can you use that data for your own evaluation needs? Is the information secure, right? Like for healthcare organizations, any PHI or protected health information has to be encrypted. And is there like any kind of charge to access this data, right? Because when you evaluate, it's so much easier to just ask your provider to export you a CSV file of, you know, how many minutes you've used or how many interpretation assignments you've had on site versus video, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it can save you so much time that you can spend more time evaluating that data, crunching the numbers and doing different things and telling different stories with it, instead of just trying to track it all down, right? Infrastructure is another important consideration when you're choosing an LSP, like what is the average speed of answer, or ASA, which is another industry term. You know, are they going to build that into a contract? You know, how quickly do they respond to you on weekends and evenings? If it's phone, you know, how often are they dropping calls? You know, it's all stuff that you'll become familiar with when you start using the services more. But just, you know, the point of all this is just to say that you should really be asking the hard questions, because I think it's pretty prevalent within the industry for one, LSPs to use sort of like the cheapest interpreters they can find, and they don't always necessarily train them very well. And two, it can be very predatory for independent, kind of like the way Uber gets a bad rap, or deservingly, for sort of, you know, just not really providing real economic opportunity to their linguists, paying them pennies on the dollar, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to make sure that you're working with a company that has good practices in place. And, you know, then we talked about finally, you know, for the who, those critical communicators and community partnerships, right? So your priests within the communities and the English learning communities, religious leaders, librarians, community advocates, people who have regular contact, community or tribal leaders, elders, employers, social service providers who work within the communities on the ground. And if you can, you know, start brainstorming even now the names of people who you can contact and start to build strategic partnerships with. And through those partnerships, you can, you know, distribute your translated materials within communities through these trusted channels to help discredit myths, you know, provide up-to-date, accurate information, and really just, you know, maintain a line of communication with the English learners in your service area. So the big, you know, final piece is evaluation. And this is one that, you know, has so many different components, and it can vary so much from provider to provider. But it's really an important part of any language access plan. Excuse me. So, you know, with any service, or just like any service, language service delivery and operations need to be adjusted and improved continually to meet the needs of your consumers, your providers, and your staff. So there are a million different ways you can monitor and evaluate the success of your program, the changes in your program, et cetera, et cetera. And there's really no one-size-fits-all solution, but here are my suggestions for some key features to start thinking about as an evaluation strategy. You know, building teams who are responsible for measurement and performance improvement, keeping current on community demographics and needs, identifying performance targets for service delivery and operation, monitor utilization rates, right? That's where you want your LSP to be able to get you data. Surveying the consumers, right? That's keeping close contact with the English learning communities that you're serving and making sure their voices are heard, and developing improvement strategies. So we'll go through these one by one, and then we'll have about 15 minutes to talk, you know, about what's worked for you all, or anything that I can clarify for you. And so the first one is, building teams who are responsible for measuring and improving the performance of all of the language access services within your organization. So you're going to work with the coordinators, the point people, the language service providers, and you want to spell out an improvement plan for measuring and improving your language services, right? So the staff members, leaders, and coordinators that you have identified to implement your plan, right? So those champions within different departments, put together a subcommittee or a team of language services staff who can support the plan in terms of measuring and improving the service operations, right? So these can be senior leaders who are responsible for allocating resources. It's really great if you can get one of them to be a champion. Individuals who are directly involved in providing the language access services, right? So that head nurse or director or frontline staff. Stakeholders, including the consumers themselves, the English learners and their families. Departments that support the delivery of language access services, such as information technology or human resources, for example. It's really big to have those two pieces or those two groups on your side, because HR is going to be able to advocate for you if, in terms of this is a legal requirement and there's liability exposure and it's worth the expense, et cetera, et cetera. And excuse me, then your IT departments, because they can really help you with communication and dissemination of information. So for example, you're going to need support from language services staff for internal tasks like data collection, as well as support from individuals outside of your department, such as, like a physician or a nurse champion to help with, targeted improvement efforts within the subset of your consumers that they see, right? The second thing is keeping current on community demographic needs. Engage local public health authorities, school districts, faith communities, refugee resettlement agencies, and other critical communicators on a regular basis, right? And you can, like I said, keeping those relationships warm is very important, and you can decide the frequency with which. And I think it's important to put that in your language access plan, because if it's in the plan, it will guide you, and you can, put a reminder in your calendar for every X amount of time to reach out to X person to make sure that you are staying connected to them, and, that therefore you're keeping your finger on the pulse of what's happening in your communities as well. I recommend quarterly as reaching out to your critical communicators, but that might vary depending on how busy you are and what resources you have to do that, and what the need is. Some people do it annually. Some people are regularly out there, every month hitting the pavement with people, and that's really going to be up to you and what your organization's needs are. The third thing is identifying those performance targets for language services delivery and operations. So review your current baseline with respect to key aspects of performance. And what I kind of mean by that is identify performance gaps in language service delivery and operations. And that needs assessment form that was passed out to you last week, that was adapted from the federal lep.gov website, is a good tool for that, because it asks a lot of uncomfortable questions, and just about everybody I've ever watched fill out that needs assessment finds that they're lacking in a lot of places, which, is fine, right? It just gives you your baseline. It tells you what you can improve. It gives you goals, right? It's not intended to shame anyone or to make anyone feel bad about what they're not doing, but rather to kind of act as a guide for things that you can think about implementing. So, some organizations can easily identify those performance gaps, but keep in mind that if you are not keeping proper data collection protocols in place, you might not be measuring everything that's necessary. So like, for example, some organizations only collect information on consumers that receive language services and not records of consumers who don't need them, right? And so the data is going to be skewed whether you think about it from one perspective or another. So it's important to kind of think about harvesting as much information as possible about how you're interacting with these populations, including, you know, estimates for who's not using your services. And then you can kind of dig down and try to get to the why, right? Why aren't they utilizing these services? What's holding them back? You know, for this piece, identifying performance targets, you want to set reasonable goals and performance targets for your program. And you can base those on your current baseline information, you know, where you want your program to be and when, what time frame, what has to happen for you to get there, and then sort of any national or regional benchmarks. Monitoring the utilization rates of different types of language access services being used in your organization is another great way for you to look at performance and collect data, right? Like how many in-person interpreter assignments did you do in Q1 and Q2 and Q3? And you can get more granular and break it down by language. And that's going to inform, you know, choices like what are your top 5 languages? Who do you need to reach? Who's using your services and who's not? Like I said, you can have your LSPs export to you on a monthly basis. If you're doing over the phone interpretation or video remote interpretation, they should be able to just send you a file that shows you what your usage is, and you can track that over time. You can visualize it, you can tell a compelling story with the data, et cetera, et cetera. And a big piece of this, you know, performance targets and identification are going to be conducting surveys of the consumers, of your organization's consumers, the English learners for whom you work. You want to ask them about their experiences using your services, right? And that includes language assistant services. And it also really elevates their voice by sort of, you know, reaching out and making sure they're part of the process. And, you know, you can continually improve your own operations, you know, based on those experiences. So finally, within the evaluation piece, and remember, this is just a small slice of the pie chart of ways and means to evaluate, and that's really going to differ from organization to organization. But these are some that I think really are in the middle of that Venn diagram. And the last one is, you know, developing strategies to improve the performance of your services, right? That should be the ultimate goal, constant improvement. And, you know, this just basically means, you know, identifying target areas for your improvement efforts, right? Through that, you know, internal needs assessment. Think strategically to sort of avoid biting off more than you can chew. So start small within one department or one segment of your organization, or with one group of consumers, one language pair, you know, who are not receiving the services that they need. You can work closely with stakeholders and language service teams to design strategies and tools that can, you know, help achieve improvements. Some organizations already have a specific model for systems and process improvement. And if this is true in your organization, you can use your organization's existing model whenever you develop those strategies. Asking someone from your quality improvement department to explain before you proceed can be helpful. Getting tips from people who have experience with this work is important. Because language access is such a multidisciplinary thing that if you do not have a language access coordinator or somebody who's an expert in the field, you know, no one person can be expected to know how to do all of these things and how to do them correctly. So if you are that one person out there whose organization or whose department has put all of the work on you, kudos, you're doing an amazing job. I think it's really easy for people to blame ourselves when things are incomplete or not going super well, but we tend not to accept credit when we're doing a great job. So I just want to make sure that all of you who are doing it all know that it's amazing and what you're doing is Herculean. And I know a lot of you are doing it in addition to your regular jobs. So, you know, pat on the back for yourselves for sure. You know, you can also pilot any changes you make when you're doing improvement or performance reviews for sort of a defined period of time to give you the opportunity to make adjustments before you make the changes permanent. And I think piloting is wonderfully useful because you can waste time and resources and credibility if you fully implement any kind of change before you test it, right? Remember that it's okay to make mistakes. Remember that this is new for everyone. Remember that this is hard and that nobody expects you to get it all right the first time around. But making every effort to make sure you do is an important part of the process. So another thing would be communicating your successes within your organizations and to your consumers, as a way to generate buzz, right? So it can improve communication with your consumers. It can provide notice of services, right? So if you are really proud that you have increased usage of on-site interpretation by 30% in 2019, you can create posters and storyboards and put them up throughout your facilities and in your physical brick and mortar locations and within the communities that you serve to sort of keep people aware of language access, right? So if they're seeing it, then they're thinking about it. You can have stories about it featured in your organization's website or newsletter. You can make presentations to any kind of leadership decision-making committees, or other bigwigs within your organization to show them the positive effects, right? And then communicating with the community through whatever your public relations department is, if needed, through the IT department, through your normal channels is really important. Talk about the successes, not just the deficiencies, right? So spreading, or rather a tip is to consider having providers and consumers join you in communicating those success stories. So use data on your improvement efforts when you're discussing quality with others within the organization so that they understand your work and it's not super abstract, right? I think people respond really well to numbers and not just, us talking about our successes, right? Because you can show hard data that, says things are improving. Spreading useful or successful strategies and tools to the rest of your organization can be a part of this. And you can do that by meeting with your senior leaders to discuss and show that data, and that demonstrates your improvement. And you can request their support in spreading to other parts of the organization, right? Whenever you have that information, you can identify additional champions in different departments and throughout your organization who are willing to try new strategies with you. And remember that always revising policies and procedures and best practices to include new strategies for change is an important part of the evaluation process. If something's not working, no reason to spend any more time or energy or money on it. Scrap it, try something new. And finally, implementing policies to reinforce the practices that are resulting in performance improvement, right? So it's not just chucking the bad, but also reinforcing the good. And I think really for a good language access plan to take root, it's not an overnight thing. It's not even something that can be accomplished in a year. I think it takes a good 5 years to build culture within an organization, right? And so keep that in mind, that when I say it's a living document, when I say it's okay to make mistakes, don't think of your language access plan as a static document. Think about it as a sea change within your organization that can be driven by stakeholders and subcommittees and yourself and whoever your champions are. And if you kind of start to think about implementing it across an organization in this way, I think it can really broaden the perspective on the purpose of a language access plan and on what you can really achieve with a language access plan. So, finally, before we go into the Q&A, remember that your language access plan can help ensure that your organization provides appropriate language service as a whole, but then also a language access plan can help ensure that your organization's staff members are aware of what to do when an individual with limited English proficiency needs assistance, right? So this is that idea that, I think we talk about language access planning on an organizational level, but, that head nurse or the clerk on Unit 4 or frontline staff or administrative staff who are in your brick and mortar locations, right? A language access plan is only as good as its implementation. And so if the people who are on the front lines don't understand how to use it, don't understand the best practices, don't understand the purpose, don't know how to work with language interpreters, don't understand how to gauge when they need to, use language access resources, then the plan isn't going to result in any real change, right? So keep that in mind. And that is as much information as I can cram into 45 minutes on this subject today. But we do have 15 minutes now for some Q&A. And you're also always welcome to sign up for those slots with me on Thursday afternoons. So I'm going to stop sharing now and look at all your lovely faces so that we can talk about what we've learned today. And hopefully you all have questions for each other and questions for me, or if anybody can share positive experiences that they've had, if anyone has found any of what I talked about today to be untrue or had negative experiences, share it all. This is a space for us all to talk, or not. There's no imperative, there's no rule that says that you have to talk about this stuff, but it's a great opportunity to use each other's knowledge if you have it to share. Okay, well, I'm not hearing any questions today so far. I'll give last call, and if not, then we'll go ahead and end a little bit early today because I'm finished with my presentation. The other thing I wanted to add is that next week, I am not going to be available on Monday. So we're going to move next week's session, which is going to be about language access technologies, to Tuesday at 2 p.m. Melissa will send out an updated invitation about that, but I wanted to let you all know so that you can prepare and mark your calendars for that. I apologize for the change, but pretty much every other session we're going to be on track for Mondays at 3. It's just next week. So one more last call for questions. And if not, thank you guys. I'm really enjoying these sessions. I feel like I've gotten to know a lot of you, and I really appreciate everything that you're all doing to advance language accessibility out there. All right, well, thank you guys. And always feel free to reach out, and I'll see you all hopefully next Tuesday at 2 p.m. All right.
Thanks, Mary Jane.
Thank you, everyone.